All right, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of material to cover tonight on part one of, I feel like there should be theme music, the laws. Probably a little bit of a misnomer, but we're going to go with it because we are going to be talking about Jewish law, and we're going to be talking about some specific Jewish laws. Let's start with the entire concept of law. What does it mean to have laws? Well, in order for there to be laws, as traditional Judaism teaches, and much of what we're going to do tonight is going to be using traditional Judaism as our springboard, is that you have to have a lawmaker. Now, while Moses is traditionally assumed to be the lawgiver in traditional Judaism, the lawmaker is none other but, as my professors used to call him, the Abaishta, that's Yiddish, for the one upstairs. And from there, we get the word mitzvah. Now, you've all heard mitzvah, and we use it in humanistic Judaism in this sense as well, to mean good deed. Oh, do me a mitzvah, Jeff. Go get your grandmother a glass of water. That kind of mitzvah is what I grew up with. But in fact, that's not, from a Jewish legal point of view, what mitzvah means, even though it's perfectly acceptable to use it that way as secular Jews, despite what my colleagues say. It really means a commandment. And implicit in having a commandment is a commander. So we have to put ourselves in their mindset as they were developing humanistic, as they were not humanistic, as they were developing their various approaches to Judaism or to Torah, probably it's more proper and appropriate to say. They were looking at themselves as interpreters of God's desires and God's commands. There was nothing wishy-washy about this for them. God was real and God's commands were real. The problem, of course, with most of God's commands is that they range from a few that are easy to understand to unbelievably, incredibly complicated, indecipherable, and in a not worst case scenario, probably contradicting something else that the Bible also said. What do you expect from a work that is over 2,800, 2,900 years old, that draws upon legal precedents and legal examples from all over the region? Primarily, by the way, the Code of Hammurabi, which some of you probably might be familiar with, but not only. Over time, throughout the hundreds of years of ancient Israel, about which we know so little when it comes to observance, other than what they claim to have done in the ancient temple, which may or may not match reality, certainly not in the pre-exilic period, possibly yes in the post-exilic period, by which I mean before or after 586 BCE. But aside from that, we know very little. It's only after the exile, and really after the introduction of Hellenism and the conquest of, anybody? Alexander the Great, about whom we spoke 2 weeks ago, that we really begin to see the development of something that looks like Judaisms that we recognize today. There were a number of camps that began to form. We don't have, I was going to say perfect, but from some cases, any records of how these camps of interpreters began to tease their way out and emerge from the cacophony. But we do know that sometime around the late 2nd to early 1st century BCE, there were, at least as most scholars will count them, 4 primary schools of thought, or at least groups of Jews. But they're really not so easily dividable into just 4. I'll give you some examples. There was the priestly class and the priestly group. Later, they'll become known as the Sadducees in English, and I guess that comes from Greek, of course. But in Hebrew, they were the Tzadokim. named for Tzadok, Zadok, an ancient priest mentioned in the Bible. They had their views. The temple was supported by every Jew, even the Jews that lived abroad that we spoke about last week. But nevertheless, the ones who ran it had their own opinions, and not everybody agreed with those opinions. Sadducees were the elite, but they disagreed with each other too. There were various groups of priests. Then we had groups that, particularly after the Hasmonean Empire, the Hasmonean Kingdom, began to fall in the 60s BCE, and Rome came on the scene. We had other groups. Some of them became apocalyptic types of groups. In other words, groups that looked to the era that they were in as the end of time. Arthur, you're missing a person needs to be admitted there. As the end of time. Others, the rabbis, became a dominant group only after the destruction of the temple, but clearly had a populist following of some kind, and we're going to be mostly concentrating on them tonight. Some of them were strictly political groups. We think that the Jesus followers might have fallen into that, but political doesn't mean secular. It simply means they were apocalyptic and concentrating mostly on what happens at the end, the kingdom of God arriving on earth. And by kingdom of God arriving on earth for Jews, that always meant the national resurrection of the Jewish people at the end of times. The kingdom of God was that. So Jesus, or perhaps followers of whoever John the Baptist were, but many others, particularly some of the zealot groups that were around in Jerusalem as the war began to heat up with Rome. Others who fled to Masada, who may have been part of that group of zealots, and still others who may have been part of ascetic groups, namely one that we know about that we usually call the Essenes, who are associated with the Dead Sea community and probably were the ones who produced the Essenes. We know some Jews did it, but the Essenes were probably the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so we know a lot about them. They didn't call themselves Essenes, so that's why we're not sure they're the same people. So after the temple, we saw the Sadduceans disappear. No temple, no power base, no need for it. After the temple, we saw the Zealots disappear, have a little bit of a renaissance, a resurrection. It was mostly associated with the rabbis anyway, and then they soon disappeared. The Essenes were very, very much gone. Whatever religious, philosophical, and political ideas, and those were not necessarily separate things to them, that these folks had, only one truly emerged as the dominant strain of Jewishness in the entire world, and that was rabbinical Judaism. In the New Testament, they're called Pharisees. That's a word that we don't use very often outside of academic circles to refer to the early rabbinic age, which would have been the late 1st century BCE. But they were called Pharisees because their name in Hebrew was the Prushim, which meant the separatists. So what were they separating from? Possibly the temple elite when the temple stood. Again, they weren't necessarily anti-temple, they were just anti who was running the joint. But when the temple did fall, they were positioned to become not just a dominant group in Judaism, but the dominant group. Now, that's not to say, as we learned last week, that's not to say that there were not other Jewish groups around the dispersion of the Jews. We spoke, for instance, last session, about the Hellenistic Jews, the ones living in Antioch, the ones living in Greece, the ones living in Rome or North Africa, Alexandria, a major community of them. I mentioned this fellow Philo of Alexandria. These were Jews who had many similar practices as the rabbis did, but they also seemed to have a lot of differences in ideology and theology and how they thought about the world. And we don't know what happened to them, other than a best guess that they had some good numbers outside of the land of Israel and outside of Babylon, and they may have been a very good audience for early Western Christianity to take hold in, as it was also attracting more and more non-Jews. So that's a possibility that of a very major community that we simply lost for all kinds of reasons. And we lost track of them to the extent that we can't even say how many there were or what occurred. Now, there are a few exceptions to the mass dominance of rabbinical Judaism. In the medieval times, a group emerged in Babylon, which was really one of the major Jewish communities of the world. Are you not seeing these people? Where you do that? Oh, okay. Just checking. I don't pay him enough. Remember, we're the only two people we see, period, in person. But anyway, this group was called the Karaites. This was sort of a back to the Bible movement. The back to the Bible movement consisting of people who wanted to reject rabbinical Judaism. There's still a few of them left, believe it or not. They have a congregation in Jerusalem, and they are an interesting group because when you look at them, essentially they've done with their own interpretations a parallel process as the rabbis. You can't go back to the Bible as Bible originalists. I call them that in honor of the so-called constitutional originalists in the United States. And the reason you can't, of course, is because of all the things I said earlier. The laws are incomprehensible in many cases. They're self-contradicting. They're incomplete. We don't know how to make them into a body of work. And on top of that, many, many things were really unnecessary to worry about after the destruction of the temple, that they and the rabbis continued to worry about how to make this sacrifice and that sacrifice at a time that the temple was already hundreds of years gone. Karaism never caught on. There were a few other groups, notably Beta Israel, which is the name of the Ethiopian Jewish community, was a non-rabbinical community. We believe their legend is that they're descended from the tribe of Dan in ancient Israel. They seem to be a group of early converts, perhaps pre-rabbinical era converts in Ethiopia, or at least before the rabbis rose to prominence. So what does rabbinical Judaism teach today if you're a traditional Jew? And back then, not that what we see with traditional Jews today is an exact mirror of what it was, but it's closer in some ways. Doesn't make it more authentic Judaism, because it really leaves out the possibility of much of the evolution we're going to learn about. But there are some things that both modern Orthodox Jews, for instance, and these ancient rabbis held in common. And they become the basis of rabbinical Judaism, which even an atheist humanistic rabbi, the kind of Judaism that I'm rebelling against, or the kind of Judaism that I'm participating in, is rooted in rabbinical Judaism. It's why we still use the word rabbi, which, by the way, means master in the sense of like a master of a body of material, a body of law, because the rabbis were the lawyers. They were the people who sat on the courts and who did the adjudication in all the communities that we lived in. Well, their great innovation is that they believed that there were two Torahs. Quick aside on the word Torah. The word Torah formally refers to the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, right? Genesis through Deuteronomy, the thing that's in the scroll and the conventional synagogues, and I think some of ours too, that the Jews, raise up and sing about and praise and everything else. Yes, that is the Torah. But one can be said to be studying Torah, and it essentially means you're just studying Judaism. Or one can refer to all of the Bible, the entire Tanakh, as Torah in a sort of widely expressed way. In this case, though, they're talking about the Torah itself. And they're making the claim that there were two Torahs that were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai. The first was the written Torah. Traditionally, Jews believed that the Torah, as we have it, Genesis through Deuteronomy, was dictated more or less by God to Moses. Now, interestingly enough, the Torah never makes that claim for itself. And those of you who have taken other more in-depth courses with me, we've talked about how they piece together this idea of a unitary revelation, a revealing of God's will, how they piece together this unitary revelation out of these little tiny pieces and snatches of text in the Torah that don't even make that claim. But be that as it may, that story itself becomes, in a way, part of oral Torah. Because the oral Torah, or the concept of oral Torah, teaches that while Moses was up there, he received the secrets of the interpretations of all these difficult, hard to understand texts. And we'll look at a few of them. There were two kinds of oral transmission. One is really sort of a sermonic, interpretive, lore-based. We call that midrash, and we're not going to get into that tonight. But midrash is more about lore. It's without getting too technical, it's sort of a storytelling tradition inside of the oral law. But the oral law itself is primarily concerned with getting to God's will. What is the actual mitzvah, commandment that a Jew is supposed to observe, and to get to that through these rules of interpretation that were presented to Moses at Sinai. Now, this body of law, there's really nothing else to call it. In Judaism, in Hebrew, the word is halacha. Halacha, you'll hear an English version, halachic Judaism, meaning Jewish legal or legally based Judaism. But this notion of halacha, which actually comes from the word for a path or a way, it ultimately grows and grows and grows into a number of things, notably one that you'll have heard of, the Talmud, which is, well, wider on my shelf than my hands can be on this screen. How does all of that get into Moses's ears orally at Sinai? Well, the truth is it doesn't, and they didn't make that claim. What they claimed is he got the secrets of the interpretation. 13 principles, as the rabbis later tried to tease out of these interpretations, that seem to dictate all of the ways in which a law could be parsed or interpreted or turned around or figured out or unpuzzled or whatever you want to call it. These interpretations, these rules, by the way, in and of themselves had to be teased out from the law, because it's not like somebody sat down in the 1st century CE and said, let's make up an oral law. Over a few hundred years, a lot of these laws had just sort of begun to be observed in certain ways because people just thought, well, maybe that's what it means. And the rabbis sort of adopted that, adapted it. And when they came to sit down and really try to tease out where are our rules coming from, it became pretty clear that they couldn't do it without sort of retroactively superimposing these 13 laws that they also made up. I've studied plenty of Jewish law, and there have been many a day that I will go through some interpretation and say, okay, which of the bleeping 13 interpretive rules is this supposed to come from? And whatever teacher I'm studying with, has frequently told me, don't get too tied up in those. Remember, they came up with those after they came up with some of the interpretations themselves. I hope that's not too confusing, but this entire topic can be confusing. So just keep in mind, here's the things to remember. The oral law is simply people responding to the confusion of the biblical text. Over time, a group of people emerge called the rabbis who tried to bring some order to it. They tried to figure out what are the rules by which these interpretations are being made, and bingo bango, you got your 13. But don't look for this to be some kind of systematic development of law as we might view the transition, for instance, of British law to American jurisprudence and so forth. If you think it's difficult in Western law and American law, it's that much more difficult. By the closure of the 3rd century CE, the very first codified set of Jewish laws that we would call oral Torah emerged, and it came to be known as the Mishnah. Mishnah means the teaching or the repetition. The Mishnah was, as far as we know, and this was probably true of most of those texts, not written down, but memorized. Now, there's lately been some scholarship that says, well, maybe they did write it down, but it would not be surprising that the scholars doing this would have amongst them experts in memorization of these laws who would be called upon frequently. We know this from other even current cultures and pre-literate cultures. This was very common. A literate culture that it seems like it would have been the same, even though our tendency is to insist they must have written it down. Ultimately, yes, all of this got written down. But in 200 CE, we're not entirely sure that this body of law called the Mishnah had been written down. The Mishnah was a well-organized, well-put-together list of various laws applying to everything in Jewish life, along with opinions, majority, minority represented there as well. And the Mishnah becomes ultimately, excuse me, ultimately the foundation of, leave you in some suspense there, of the Talmud. The Talmud consists of the subsequent 400 or so years of discussions of the Mishnah. It actually happened in 2 different places, though rabbis did travel from one to the other. In the land of Israel, it went on till roughly the 3rd into the 4th century, but then that was cut off. We have a version of a Talmud that we call the Jerusalem Talmud, though most of it took place in the Galilee and other places outside Jerusalem, given the fact that they had already lost 2 wars that I mentioned last time. But we call that the Jerusalem Talmud. But when most people today speak of the Talmud, they're talking about the Babylonian Talmud, what religious Jews would simply call the Bavli, meaning the Babylonian. And that's the big one that you mostly see people studying in the yeshivas and so forth. That takes the core of the Jewish law, the Mishnah, and it presents all of the conversations, again, apparently memorized by experts in this over generation after generation after generation, mostly in Aramaic and mostly in a shorthand Aramaic, which would have made it easier for legal scholars and for the memorizers to keep track of it, but which were really, really, really made Talmud study quite difficult in subsequent years. In fact, I will admit that I know a little bit of Aramaic, Talmudic Aramaic, but mostly when I study Talmud, I do it with the Hebrew translation that was provided by Adin Steinsaltz and only came out, or was only completed a few years before his death, which I think took place last year. So it's very, very difficult to study the Talmud unless you know Aramaic and all of these shortcuts really well. And even then, it's difficult. But there are people who will participate. It's a little bit sort of a shallow study in the daily study of the Talmud. They'll take 1 page a day. And I had a Talmud class that we did, some of you were in, over the spring and the summer during the, just really recently, we did it all on Zoom. Now, we talked about the 13 principles. There were some conditions in which they just made an edict. One of the most famous was when they realized that the rules of the Jubilee year in the Bible, in the Torah, that required the forgiveness of all debt after 50 years was not practical, not whether you were in charge or not in charge. There was what was called a special edict, a prosbul, that was issued. That's a second category of what we find. And the other is the idea that there are laws there that actually come from Sinai and that are, for all intents and purposes, written, even though we only know how to do them because of the oral. And I'm going to give you some specific examples. All right, in addition to trying to correct the spaghetti bowl of contradicting laws, in unclear laws, difficult to interpret or follow laws, and just downright obtuse laws, many of which we're going to talk about, or at least a few of which we're going to talk about tonight, there were also circumstances like that particular edict to undo the Jubilee, where out of laws that were out of date, laws that no longer really had any application or that seemed immoral, needed to be dealt with. And I've selected one. It's pretty commonly selected to illustrate this point. It's the lex talionis, which, if you don't know it from that language, you do know it from Exodus 21. If anyone harms their fellow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. This has its basis in the Code of Hammurabi. This is really old. And I'm sure that at the time that it was circulated, it was maybe very advanced, maybe quite progressive, because to think that maybe when you used to steal or you used to take someone's hand or eye or what have you, you served the death penalty, and now they're backing it up. But thousands of years later, in the rabbis' time, this, as many of their laws seem to them to be a little bit archaic, a little bit backward. We don't want to be taking people's tooths out of their head and chopping off their hands and that kind of thing. So I'm going to show you what happens when the rabbis, using the laws of interpretation, the rules of interpretation, which I'm not going to cite for you which ones are being applied, but when they use this kind of reasoning, show you how they deal with the very explicit commandment, the mitzvah, the unassailable language in it, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What do the rabbis sitting around do about this law that they cannot imagine ever implementing? They do this. Well, let's start with a question, says one rabbi. What if you are a scribe and someone removes your hand? Your entire livelihood is gone. But what if, on the other hand, you're a farmer and someone removes your hand? Is it of the same value to you? On one hand, right, that was probably the wrong thing to say. In one case, you have the complete destruction of one's livelihood. In the other case, though it's the same injury, it does not harm their livelihood. He can still push a plow, his children, that's how farms work, et cetera, et cetera. And what did the rabbis wind up doing? They turned eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, without changing one word of the Torah, into a code of torts, torts being legal injuries and their restitutions. They undid this mess that they had, inapplicable to the world in which they lived, and turned it into something progressive, and then turned around and told people, and believed this. I know it's hard to get that. Really believed this, that they had changed nothing. That the Torah always meant to elicit these questions from you. That it was obvious that a hand for a hand could not mean that, because hands are not the same for each person. The scribe and the farmer, they are not the same. Other messes they had to clean up revolved around unbelievable lack of clarity. We'll go back to this one later, but just to give you an example, it says in the Bible, in Deuteronomy 6, you shall bind my words, God's words, you shall bind these for a sign upon your hand. They shall be for frontlets between your eyes. The word frontlet is as useless as the word in Hebrew, totafot. We have no idea what totafot were any more than I can tell you what frontlets are. And how do you bind words to your hand? We'll talk about what they did with it in a minute. Or this one, 3 times in the Torah, Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Huh? What the hell does that mean? So these are some of the things that have a lack of clarity. So tonight we're going to look at some of these traditions that became the basis for most Jewish life, and continuing with our next lesson in 2 or 3 weeks. I know one is not on the schedule because of the holiday. And we'll be dealing with the daily mitzvot pretty much tonight, and life cycle, and then we'll look at the holidays next time. Okay, back to our point here. How do we understand the rabbinical mind? How do we understand a culture that is built upon the idea that God gave the commandments, but everything is in your hands to figure it out? Well, on one hand, it's a lovely idea. It means that, and this is what I was taught, Jews are partners in God's creation, Jews are partners in this and that. But I don't think the rabbis necessarily saw it in such 20th and 21st century terms. I'm going to tell you 2 stories that I think illustrate the rabbinical mindset. And these are famous stories. You may have heard them before, but regardless, I never tire of hearing them myself. The first is called Moses Visits the Rabbinical Academy of Rabbi Akiva. Keep in mind that Rabbi Akiva lived in the 2nd century CE. So here's the story. When Moses was on the mountain on Sinai, and he was brought up from there to the heavenly realm to receive the Torah, he found God sitting and tying crowns and little thorns and little decorations to the letters of the Torah. So how many of you have seen in real life or in pictures, you've seen the Torah scrolls, right? What they look like inside? They have all those fancy little tags and this and that come out of all the letters. It's the scribal tradition of writing a Torah scroll. And Moses sees God doing this. And he says, Master of the universe, Ribono shel olam, as they say in Yiddish, for whom are you delaying the Torah's granting on Mount Sinai? In other words, they're waiting for me. As you'll recall, they were building a golden calf. They're waiting for me, and you're holding me up with these crowns here. They must mean something. They must be important. Will you share that with me? And God says, a man will appear a few generations from now, and he shall be called Akiva. And he, among others, obviously Akiva is being used as an example, will explain each and every one of the crowns and thorns on these letters, and from them he will generate mountains of law. And Moses now is more confused than you are. And he says, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, please let me see them. And God said, turn around. It's a time machine. This is like early Jewish science fiction, which, by the way, is a genre of Jewish science fiction. And what happens when he turns around? Moses finds himself on the benches of Rabbi Akiva's academy almost 1,500 years later. He listens to the lesson of Rabbi Akiva. He has no idea what Rabbi Akiva is talking about. The Talmud said his strength dwindled. He felt weak and sad. Finally, Rabbi Akiva reached a certain item that his students remarked about and said, Rabbi, how did you reach your conclusion? How did you get to the interpretation of the law that you're teaching? And what does Akiva say? Zoti halacha leMoshe miSinai. This is halacha, a Jewish law that goes back to Moses at Sinai. Now, we don't really find out how Moses felt about this, at least not in a satisfying way to the end of our science fiction episode here. But what we do learn from this is that the rabbis had a sort of self-awareness, a sort of self-consciousness that taught them that they were doing something extraordinary here, that they believed to be firmly anchored in God's words at Sinai, but also knew enough to recognize that times had changed and that what had emerged from the oral law, though they continued to claim that God gave it to them, was really something for them to take hold of. That's one of my interpretations. Now, here's the second story. one of the most beloved of especially liberal rabbis like this, because it shows us the I don't want to say conscious, but the awareness, the somewhere awareness inside of them of what they were really doing. So it's called the oven of Aknai, but neither the oven nor Aknai have any importance here. The rabbis are arguing over the kashrut. The word kashrut means the kosherness. We're going to hear that word again in a few moments. The kosherness of a certain oven. And we're not going to talk about what the problem was with it either, because nobody cares. The name Aknai refers to a serpent, and it has to do with the fact that the arguments encircled each other like serpents. In any case, here's the story about the purity of this oven. It involved the great rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, and his task in the house of study, the Beit Midrash, the house of study, was to try to convince his colleagues that his reasoning about this oven was correct. And yet there was another rabbi present, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah. So we've got Eliezer on one hand and Joshua on the other. None of his arguments was accepted by the majority. And here, verbatim from the Talmud. So after failing to convince the rabbis with logic, with these snake-like arguments, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, to try to prove his point, if I'm right, if the halakha, the law, is in accordance with my opinion, you see that carob tree outside our window? It will prove it. And suddenly that carob tree magically was uprooted oh, for goodness sake. I'm sorry, my computer just decided that it was time for me to update something, and I don't want to update it. Okay. Anyway, the carob tree was uprooted from its place, and some say it moved 100 cubits, others say it moved 400 cubits. Magic carob tree. The rabbi said to him, we do not cite halachic proofs from moving carob trees. Rabbi Eliezer then said, all right, well, if the halacha is according to me, to my opinion, you see that stream on the other side of the other window over there? It will prove it. The water in the stream turned backwards and began to flow in the opposite direction. What did the rabbi say? Did they say, oh, you are right, Rabbi Eliezer? No, they did not. They said, we do not accept halachic decisions from streams. Rabbi Eliezer went on. He said, well, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of this Beit Midrash, this house of study, will prove it. And then the walls of the Beit Midrash began to lean in almost until they fell. Rabbi Joshua, his opponent, turned to the walls. He looked up at the walls and he said, when Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of Jewish law, you have nothing to do with this dispute. He rebuked the laws. Rabbi Eliezer then said to his colleagues, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, let heaven prove it. Suddenly, a divine voice, an echo of the voice of God, as it says in the Talmud, came down and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? The halacha is always in accord with his opinion, every place that he has an opinion. Rabbi Joshua, the opponent, stood on his feet and said, did you not tell us in Deuteronomy, quote, the Torah is not in heaven that you shall say who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us so that we may hear it? Did you not say in Deuteronomy, neither is it beyond the sea that you shall say who shall cross over the other side of the sea for us and get it for us? No, your Torah said, the Torah is very near to you. It is in your mouth and your heart for you to observe. What was Rabbi Joshua saying here? He was arguing that built into the Torah, and this is how they justified everything they did, was the permission for them to be the final arbiters as long as they didn't cross the boundaries of those 13 principles that obviously they invented retroactively and superimposed on what had been going on for hundreds of years anyway. There's a little bit of an epilogue to this that I'll, even though we got about a half an hour. I am going to go a little bit over 8 tonight, but I'll share the little epilogue too. One of the epilogues tells us that the walls never fell, but they never stood up again. And in tribute to these two great rabbis, they always sort of leaned in forever. So whether there was such a big midrash or not, they were basing the story on, I do not know, and nor does anyone else. But there was another rabbi altogether who had the opportunity when he died to ask none other than Elijah the prophet what had happened. He says, what happened when Rabbi Joshua scolded the divine voice, quoted Deuteronomy to God? What happened? Elijah the prophet said, well, God smiled and said, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. So I happen to love that story. It's a great story for liberal rabbis, but I think it's also embraced by traditional Jews who see in this a way to cut the Gordian knot, if you will, of the complication about which came first, the oral or the written Torah. As far as they were concerned, they were co-equal and they balanced each other out. And as long as you were loyal to the principles of the oral Torah, you would never make a mistake so great in interpreting the written Torah that it would be a violation of God's will, even if carob trees, streams, and bold and rebellious walls were about to fall on you. And that's how they would see it. So in this time that we have left, we're going to talk about what were some of the observances. What did the rabbis do? Well, they had an enormous project ahead of them. To remind you, the entirety of the Jewish enterprise was built around the temple. Even if you were living in Alexandria or Antioch or Babylon, you were constantly thinking about the connection to the temple. Even if your Jewish lives were not surrounding it, it was the center, very, very much the center. And the temple was gone. In the year 70, it disappeared. So how did the rabbis rise to prominence? There are all kinds of legends about it. Legends that talk about how the Romans allowed for the building of an academy at Yavne near Tel Aviv. We know that academy existed. Mostly, though, it was because they were the surviving group. They had been relatively pacifistic during the war, and they were populists when it came to Jewish behavior and Jewish interpretation. And even as far as the diaspora, far-flung communities, where they were not necessarily sharing all the same ideological opinions and theological opinions as the rabbis, they would rely on what they thought about how you observe things because they were just as confused. The first thing the rabbis had to do was to create some kind of substitute for the temple. The temple was constantly in motion, with enormous numbers of people offering prayers, yes, praises, yes, but mostly sacrifices to God. It was a self-generating economy all of its own. The sacrifices were eaten by the priests. It was their main source of food. Some of the sacrifices were grain, fruit, vegetables. Others were animal sacrifices. But and there was also an enormous temple treasury, so they could buy all the cool clothes that priests always like to wear to this day. The prayers that they established, they had to make an argument, make a case for the Jews, would now be a substitute for sacrifices. They called this the avodah, the service of the sacrifice, shebelev, of the heart. And they created all kinds of, or continued, I can't say they created, continued and promoted all kinds of traditions about how to do things. So when it came to prayer, they would match up the timing of the prayer services to the timing of the sacrifices in the ancient temple. You've heard that Jews pray 3 times a day, although there's not usually 3 distinct prayer services because a couple can get combined each afternoon and evening. But yes, the names of the prayer services the morning, afternoon, and evening service are named for those periods of time from the daily sacrifices. The additional sacrifice that was performed on Shabbat and most holidays takes on the name for the prayer service. It's called the Musaf, the additional. I always love the fact that in modern Israel, the Israelis, the secular Israelis, named their supplement to the Friday afternoon or Friday morning paper, the Shabbat paper, they call that the Musaf. And that was a sort of a deliberative kind of secularization of that word. What about the practices of prayer? Well, they created a liturgy that is really magnificent in many ways. We don't know how long it took to develop into what we have today, but we are amazed to see so many of the prayers that are part of traditional Judaism recited in Reconstructionist, Conservative, Reform, and Orthodox synagogues in one form or another to this day, that they are found in one form or another very similar in the Talmud. And so they began that process. And as you know, daily prayer is central. For Jewish men, it's obligatory, whether it's with a minyan, a quorum of 10 men, which you need in order to say certain prayers, notably the Kaddish, which we'll talk about in a minute, or whether it's done alone at home. They codified practices that had been long in play, particularly some of the garb. So I mentioned earlier, I'm getting up an audio, not an audio, but a visual assistance. They had codified earlier, earlier interpretations of certain practices. Can you all see this okay? Yeah, okay. So for instance, the same place in Deuteronomy that we learned about the frontlets, and we'll talk about them in a minute, we also learn about the fringes. You're supposed to wear fringes on the corners of your clothing. Now, keep in mind, in those days, everybody's clothing had four corners. They were wearing, kind of robes and things, so they had corners. Nowadays, traditional men continue to wear a four-cornered garment to honor that mitzvah, honor that commandment. Here's an example on the left here of a gentleman wearing it sort of in the more, I guess you call it the fiddler on the roof mode. But this fella here on the right, he's wearing it the way you see a lot of Orthodox Jews wearing it. I had a very good friend who was an Orthodox rabbi who, when I was very traditional, was a sort of mentor to me. He used to kid about this because he wore tzitzit. These are called tzitzit, the fringes. It's a talit katan, a small talit or talis in Yiddish. But he used to wear, he tucked his into his pants. He never saw any reason. And I know Orthodox Jews who don't wear them at all. I can tell you for a fact that certain people that I'm very close to don't wear them. Why? Because they don't normally wear a four-cornered garment. So why tie them on? But this is how the rabbis would work. They would look at this command and they would say, how can we make this work for people? How can we, for instance, tie them? The Torah doesn't say anything about how to tie them. Tie them in a way that reminds us of the Torah. Well, if we're supposed to look at them as the verse in the Bible says, you look at them and you contemplate the commandments, maybe the way that we knot them, can you see the little knots there? Maybe the way that we knot them could resemble or represent the 613 enumerated commandments. Here's a different version of a talis that the rabbis really invented. This is the talis that you pray in, the talit that you pray in. Here's a pretty traditional looking one. This guy has one. I used to have a big collection of these. I probably still do somewhere. I should give them to my grandson, but this is these things run some money, let me tell you. And they're very pretty. A lot of people like them. Women now wear them. Here you can see a bat mitzvah young woman in a tie-dye one. And here's some rabbis, I guess, some maybe conservative or reform rabbis at the wall. What about these frontlets? Well, every weekday, Orthodox men and some women who are conservative women, I know one Orthodox woman who does this, that's it, the sum total, and I know a few Orthodox people, they figured out that these frontlets are what we call now in Hebrew tefillin. Tefillin comes from the word tefillah, which means prayer. And they strap these on. That's a leather ball. They're completely made of leather. These boxes are made of leather, and it's formed on the hand. There are different ways to tie it, but if you look at it in a certain way, it's supposed to spell out here a shin, here a dalet, and here a yud. So it's a name of God, Shaddai. Here's the head tefillin. These contain those very verses from Deuteronomy 6, both on the arm and the head. And here's a young, probably a bar mitzvah in Israel, and he's got the whole thing going on here. He's got the head tefillin, and he's got the arm tefillin. Women never wore tefillin except in legend. There were a couple, but I wouldn't have been able to get through this thing on prayer and tefillin without showing you a couple of illustrations. This actually is from a Jewish feminist group encouraging women to do it. And here you see, this is in Jerusalem or something. You see, I would venture to say these are conservative or reform rabbis or Jews, Jewish women who have not only a talis on, but they are wearing not only a talit, but are also wearing the tefillin. The word talit comes in a lot of forms, which is why you hear me stumbling over it. Talit is the Hebrew, and talis is the Yiddishized Hebrew, and they even have different plurals. Now let's move on to another important tradition, those little things that you see over people's doors. It said, write them on the doorposts of your house. Well, what are you supposed to do? Go write a whole Torah on the doorposts of your house? Well, instead, you take that verse, those verses, which start with the word Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, which is the central proclamation, Hear, O Israel, Adonai, Yahweh is our God, Adonai alone. It's supposed to be the central pronouncement of monotheism. I don't really believe it's such a monotheistic statement, but it's understood that way. And it's written on a little scroll by hand, rolled up and placed on the doorposts of your house. Every room that's not a toilet or a closet, in other words, the places where you dwell, those are the rooms that get the little thing that we came to call a mezuzah. And the little housing usually has a shin on it to remind us again of one of the names of God, although it could stand for shalom, I suppose, if you're a humanistic Jew. I have one on my front door. Almost every Jew I've ever met has one on their front door. But in my children's home, they have them on every room, except the bathrooms and the closets. And they hang it about 2/3 of the way up. The Talmud, one rabbi said, hang it like this or fix it like this. And we're talking about just the scroll. The housing for it isn't even required. Another rabbi said, do it like this. And so how do we do it? We do it like that because we make the controversy. We make the compromise. All right, moving on from prayer and worship-oriented kinds of things like tefillin and talis and even the mezuzah, which qualifies. Mine, I think, what do we have in ours? A4 or something like that? We have.
You put my artisan.
No, we got rid of that. We changed that. Yeah, I think we put A4 in it. Let's move on to something that's part of the daily life of millions of Jews still, and that is the dietary laws, kashrut. Kashrut refers to the system of things that are kosher. And what does kosher mean? It means that something is fit, appropriate. So can a Torah scroll be kosher or non-kosher? Yep. Doesn't mean you can eat it if it's kosher. It just means it's fit. A mezuzah needs to be a kosher mezuzah, written by hand according to certain rules and so forth. Anything that Jews use for ritual purposes, and some that are not, have to be kosher. But that doesn't always mean what you eat. Kashrut, however, by and large refers to the whole system. What does it include? Some of it really is in the Bible, or at least hinted at in the Bible. The rules of humane slaughter that are basically lifted from the customs and the rules of sacrificial slaughter. Other things that are directly from the Torah and very, very straight from the Torah are the foods that you're not allowed to eat. So the Bible gives you sort of an easy to remember little a guidebook to it. The things you're allowed to eat, the animals, if it's in the sea, it has to swim. In other words, it can't just be dwelling at the bottom, and it has to have scales. If you are getting it, so no shellfish, right? If you are if you're eating a mammal, it has to have a cloven hoof and chew the cud, which leaves out a lot of animals, like the pig, for instance. And there are even certain kinds of insects that are permitted, believe it or not. Certain kinds of microscopic ones are not. Recently, there's been a big, since microscopes became popular, I don't know, this started up. Orthodox Jews didn't used to worry about this before, because if you couldn't see it really easily, you didn't worry about it. But there's certain kinds of aphids and things like that that are, if you really look under a magnifying glass. So these companies formed in the last 30 or 40 years that sell the lettuce and these other kinds of tightly bunched vegetables like cauliflower and broccoli, and they'll inspect them, like scientifically inspect them for you. And they're very expensive. My favorite story of this is when a day school, a Jewish day school, which was paying a fortune for this lettuce, called one of the companies that was doing this after finding a pretty sizable bug in it and complained about it and sent a picture of it to him and said, we're spending a fortune on this lettuce, and here's a bug you should have been able to see with your bare eyes you're sending to me, and they're in my lettuce. And the rabbi who was in charge of the inspection said, yes, but that's not one of the ones we're looking for. Apparently, had they eaten it, it may not have been tasty, but it would have been kosher. So here's my favorite, and I saw some of you were discussing it in the comments in the chat, although it's hard for me to read it as you're going. And that's, how do you observe the mitzvah that says in 3 places in the Torah with no context, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk? As far as we know, and we don't know much, this may have been related to some kind of ancient Near Eastern custom. Either they didn't like it, or they wanted to separate themselves from it, or who knows. It's really plunged in darkness. But if you are trying to figure out what that means, you need to come up with something. Another joke. Moses on Mount Sinai is receiving these written commandments 3 times as God dictates it to him in Exodus 23. Again, when he gets to chapter 34 of that book. Again, in Deuteronomy 14, keeping in mind that this is not, this is all make-believe. He hears, Moses, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses, trying to understand, as the rabbis later will, what this means, says, okay, I think I understand, God. We should not have dishes that are the same for meat things and milk things. And God says, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, I gotcha. I think I understand what's happening here. If we should accidentally get 1 fork that's like this, and it's a meat and it goes in the dairy, we should boil it, and in some cases bury it. I understand. This is what I'll tell them. And God says the 3rd time, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, I'm following you, God. No cheeseburgers, out of the question. We're good. I'm ready to move on. To which God replies, hi, Moses, do whatever the hell you want. Let's move on to our next one. And we're not gonna end terribly late, but we are gonna go over the 8 o'clock time. Circumcision. Circumcision, now we're entering the life cycle, having talked about prayer and kashrut. Let's start with the life cycle. In Genesis, we learn how Abraham, in order to enter the covenant, has to circumcise himself. He's no youngster. And his newborn son at the age of 8, and everyone else in his household, which is surprising that he had any household left, There must have been a very, very big unemployment problem for them to stay with him through this particular thing. And what does he do? He undergoes the rite of circumcision. Um, yes, you're right. A lot of them were slaves. Everybody had to do it though, and they undergo the rite of circumcision. We call this colloquially in American Judaism anyway. We call it a bris, but that is a very incorrect word for it. The word bris is the Yiddishization of the Hebrew word brit, and the Hebrew word brit means covenant. And this is how you enter the covenant, through the brit of what is known as milah. Milah is circumcision. So if you're going to convert, you also need to undergo the circumcision covenant, or the covenant of circumcision. Now, I'm not going to go on too long with this. I think you know what circumcision is. It's performed on the eighth day. It is always the life and health of the baby takes precedence. I will be honest with you, while certainly many humanistic Jews do submit their kids to circumcision, it's not my thing. I had 2 daughters, so I never had to face it. At the time, I wasn't a humanistic Jew, but I don't have to live with the thought that I did it either. When my grandson was circumcised 3-some years ago, Arthur and I, of course, went up for the Brit Milah, for the bris, and we sat in the kitchen. I was offered the honor, it's a big one too, of holding Jack on the pillow, which means I'm holding him while he's getting circumcised. I've been up close and personal with more than one circumcision. The last thing I wanted now as a humanistic rabbi was to witness that on my grandson. So where did Arthur and I spend the circumcision ceremony? In the kitchen with the women folk. Not all the women. There were women who were in the bigger room in my ex-wife's house, but we were there in the kitchen, and we had the same expression that each of them had too, which was, because as you hear it, you know exactly what's going on. My preference is, and by the way, there's a growing movement, not of humanistic Jews, but of Reform Jews, conservative Jews, and secular Jews in Israel, who are questioning whether or not circumcision should be retained as a Jewish custom. And it is one of the few things that I get emotional about on the side of abolition. I don't understand the necessity of it. It seems to have been some kind of ancient, perhaps Egyptian custom that we borrowed, and nobody knows why people circumcise. Let's move on to another one that we're all familiar with. The next stage in a child's life, we celebrate their bar mitzvah. Now, that's a tradition for a boy. It was only about 100 years ago that we started to talk about a ceremony of bat mitzvah. And that was actually Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism and the author of Judaism as a Civilization, which some of you read almost entirely through with me in one class, who invented that one for his own daughter in 1922. But here's the surprise. There were no bar mitzvah, much less bat mitzvah, ceremonies of any kind until about 500 or 600 years ago. That was not a ceremony. Bar mitzvah, though we talk about it colloquially in English, and even sometimes in Hebrew it comes out this way, that we got bar mitzvahed, or my favorite, Rabbi Wein bar mitzvahed me, or Rabbi Baumgard, that was my rab, bar mitzvahed me. In fact, nobody can bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah anyone, because it didn't really start out that way. And I'm only speaking about it grammatically. Grammatically, a bar mitzvah means a mitzvah doer. And it was a simple result of the idea that for the purposes of mitzvot, not everything, but for the purposes of, for instance, daily prayer requirements, or putting on tefillin, talis, it depends on your community. Some men don't start doing that till they're married. But for the purposes of fasting on Yom Kippur and some of the other things we'll talk about when we get to holidays next week, you weren't required to do that until you were an official mitzvah doer. Bar does mean son, in Aramaic, by the way, but what is a son of a mitzvah? You remember when Saddam Hussein kept talking about the mother of all battles, and we kept quoting him? What he was doing was using an Arabic term. I hate to use him as the example, but people tend to remember that quote. He was using a Semitic, a feature of the Semitic language that you would use master or mother or father or something like this to mean haver or doer or greatest of or whatever. And so a bar mitzvah doesn't mean you're the son of a mitzvah. It means that you are now a doer of mitzvahs. A mother of all battles is not a mother of battles. It means it's a really big battle. One of the biggest battles. Well, this is like a mitzvah doer. And the Talmud taught, the Mishnah actually, so even earlier, that girls at 12 years old were now mitzvah doers. They had very many fewer obligations because women were not obligated to many of these time-bound commandments. That's a whole area of Jewish law that in an introductory class I can't get into. But they weren't bound to these time-bound things. There are a few exceptions, lighting candles on Shabbat. But they were bound to, for instance, pray every day, even if it was on their own schedule, to certainly to keep kosher in an approved way, etc. Couldn't get away with a lot of nonsense, to separate milk and meat. My 2.5-year-old, almost 3-year-old grandson is not strict about milk and meat separation. They're not served to him at the same meal, but he doesn't have any waiting time between them and some of these more obscure things that we're not always aware of. In the 13th, 14th century, probably as Jews were becoming slightly more literate, it became the custom to invite boys to make the blessing over the Torah, and then ultimately to start talking a little bit about the Torah. Girls didn't get a ceremony, as I said, until 1922. But since then, it has been growing and growing and growing among the Orthodox, among the Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist movements, to the point that when I was a kid, it was still sort of like a second-class bar mitzvah, maybe like a Friday night thing, and they didn't read Torah or they read something else, to where we are now, and where we were for a lot of my friends even back then, that it's a completely equivalent ceremony. So we have that. But even in the Orthodox world, girls will today celebrate bat mitzvah, not in a synagogue setting, but in a party, frequently an all-women's party, but one that still features a learned discourse about the week's portion. The Torah portion is broken up. The Torah readings are broken up into a year of different readings. So that's actually kind of an advancement in modern Orthodox circles. You do not find this in non-modern circles. And I should have mentioned that, of course, in Reform and Conservative Judaism, and even in some modern Orthodox circles, there are more and more elaborate celebrations to welcome daughters into the world. Although I will say, and maybe it was probably the pandemic, that though my ex-wife and I, she's now Orthodox, I'm obviously not, we did these for our daughters. We had really elaborate ceremonies for them. My new granddaughter didn't have one, but I wonder if maybe it would have been different if we could all have gone and visited. Let's talk just for a few moments now about marriage and divorce. In Judaism, we are not traditionally a monogamous people. Like Islam, like other parts of the ancient Near East, polygamy was not only allowed, but it was common. And so it was not until we arrived in Europe and began to become part of that world, and I mentioned this in our last session, that to match what Christians were doing, we became monogamous. It still didn't apply to Sephardic Jews. And in fact, it was a 1,000-year proclamation that was made by the rabbi, and it expired in my lifetime. But other rabbis have renewed it. The last polygamous Jews came actually from the Arab world into Israel in the late 1940s. I think the Yemenites were the last ones, really, and they were permitted to keep whatever additional wives they had at the time, but no further polygamy was permitted. What about weddings? How do they fit in? What is the idea behind a Jewish marriage? Well, the rabbis describe Jewish marriage as kinyan, acquisition. The man acquires the woman. Now, women have always been seen as a kind of property in traditional societies, pre-civilization, post-civilizational societies. Pre-civilization, there's more and more evidence that that we were quite egalitarian. A whole different lecture. If you're interested, I tell about the development of sexuality and how it relates to humanism in a lecture I gave about 3 years ago. You could probably find it somewhere. And the rabbis really had to go by the Torah on this. How did you marry someone? You had sex with them. Now, this can create all kinds of complications, of course, because once you've done that, who's to say you did it if there were no witnesses? And so the rabbis began to ceremonialize the things that they detected in the written law using their oral interpretive skills. So they noticed that there were 3 different kinds of ways that the Bible tended to speak about the acquisition of wives. One was through some kind of promissory that was made between 2 parties. Another was by a dowry, or even giving the woman something of value. And the third was through sexual intercourse. And they ritualized these. When you go to a Jewish wedding today, I don't care if it's one of ours or one of the Orthodox, you're still likely to see, not always, because liberal rabbis have, give a great deal of choice, but you're still likely to see a Jewish wedding document. We call it a ketubah. You're likely to see the exchange of value, of something of value, the ring. In more traditional settings, the woman gets the ring alone, but in all the other movements, they exchange rings. And how do you represent the act of sexual intercourse? Well, you represent it by an artistic depiction of the wedding chamber, of the marital bed, and that's the chuppah, the wedding canopy. It represents the home, the room, etc. What about divorce? Well, of course, we know that Jews allow for divorce. I'm divorced. I'm remarried, but I'm divorced. So we've had that, but the Bible places limitations on it. It says that only a man can initiate a divorce, and it's been very difficult to get around that. Some men today in secular societies go ahead and get themselves a civil divorce without granting a religious divorce to their wives. And that way they keep their wives chained to them. And in fact, those women are known as chained women, agunot. An aguna is a woman who is still chained to a man. One man in Israel is one of the few places you can really enforce this. Although in New York and other big Jewish populations, they have ordered men to do this. The courts have, but they're hesitant to get into religious issues. But in Israel, there was legendarily one man who spent his entire life in jail because he refused to give his wife a Jewish divorce, known as a get. And when he died, the rabbi said that she had to mourn for him, so do the traditional period of mourning, Shiva, for him. And she said words to I don't know, how do you say it in Hebrew? Yossi and Durit. It starts with an F and it ends with a U. So that's basically how she mourned him. But the good news is that while women could not initiate divorce, this was considered still in Jewish law, as opposed to some other laws around there. This was a little bit progressive in the sense that women could refuse divorces. And that was significant. Women could not be cast out. They could refuse. And in fact, the ceremony for the awardance of a divorce to this day includes a woman accepting the divorce, which it's a very, I went through the ceremony. And it's not always that the husbands aren't always there in person because they can have a surrogate, but the woman holds out the hand and the Beit Din, the rabbinical court, the head rabbi, will drop it in her hands. And then she has to walk 3 paces with it to demonstrate that it was taken willingly. So that's marriage and divorce. And the rabbis managed to build this system, oral law coming out of written law. And where we'll end tonight is with just a brief discussion of death and mourning. So one of the things that the rabbis believed was that Jews, when they died, had an afterlife. This was never something that was terribly clear in the Torah or the rest of the Bible. The Bible speaks about going down to Sheol, but it seems to just basically be a blank area of nothing. In other words, probably closer to what really happens, at least in my estimation, which is that, we begin and then we end. And when we end, we end. You don't have to worry about it. What's it going to be like when you're dead? It's going to be like what it was for you in the 1350s. Which is to say nothing. That's my opinion. And we live on through the people who remember us until, 4 generations down. If we're lucky, maybe they're searching for us in a census form at ancestry.com. And if we're unlucky, we've been forgotten altogether. But the rabbis did believe in an afterlife, and they believed that the afterlife would include the Messianic era, that era of the kingdom of God on earth. They really believed that this would happen on earth, that we would be, and here's the thing they invented, resurrected from the dead. That's how you get to it with Jesus. Jesus's resurrection was not unique. It was just first. And in fact, if you look through, and I'm going to mess up which book it is, but I think it's Matthew in the New Testament, there is a lot of resurrecting going on throughout Jerusalem and the land of Israel after Jesus resurrects. Zombies are walking around everywhere. And why they're telling you that story is because that was the Jewish tale. We would all come out of the earth. Someone who I'm no longer married to, that was more than I wanted to give away, actually purchased a grave, a plot in Jerusalem, because if you're outside Jerusalem, it will take you longer for your body to get to Jerusalem because you have to roll underground to get to it. These are stories and things that were made up by the rabbis and by later generations of rabbis. But the bottom line is that means you have to be buried. Now, what about if you donate organs? They used to forbid it, but now they say, well, God can grow you back a new one. They also don't tell us very much about what happens between the time we die and this Messianic era. And as you may have noticed, there's been no Messianic era. And one of the things that Jews at least are pretty honest about is the Messiah hasn't come, because if he had, we'd have all heard about it. What's happening in between, nobody knows. And that's one of the things about Judaism that I always liked, even as a kid. Judaism didn't really, if you got rid of the silly idea about the end of time and the rabbis, the coming of the Messiah and the kingdom of God on earth, etc., that we'd be living in a paradise on earth, what you were left with was nobody had a clue. And that made me feel good, because I realized I think we do have a clue, but at least nobody that was teaching me had a clue. Now, in many Jewish circles, cremation is becoming quite common. And this is not just among humanistic Jews who get cremated in the higher 50s percentile. In fact, I would say it's even getting higher than that. Americans, by the way, it's hitting new highs in terms of cremation, particularly when people consider that a cremation can cost $900 or $1,000 versus burial, which can cost upwards of 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. There's almost no ceiling on it. And so it's become more and more popular among many Jews. Many rabbis, conservative reform, who hate it, have had to accommodate it. You can tell they're accommodating it because when you go to the cemeteries, I noticed this more in Florida, where the cemeteries were owned by corporate concerns, but it's here too. You'll see, I forgot what they call them, but they're basically like mortuary kinds of, not mortuary, what's the word I'm looking for? Mausoleums, but just mausoleums, but for cremains.
They look like P.O. boxes.
They look like P.O. boxes. Whereas many people just, scatter them to the winds or bring them to us, to our memorial gardens. Once a person dies, there's a whole procedure, and we don't have time to get into that. But from what the rabbis interpreted in their laws was that there were certain things that were essential. A funeral where a person was eulogized. There are, believe it or not, some times of year when we don't eulogize. I always wondered how that would work for Orthodox Jews because I never obeyed those laws as a rabbi. And then maybe 30 years ago now, one of my Hillel students, when I was a young Hillel director, his father died. And during the middle of Passover, which is a forbidden time to eulogize. And what did the rabbi do? He brilliantly told a story of the patriarchs that was really a story of this young man's father. And it was one of the most beautiful things I ever saw. And I realized they do eulogize, they just do it in a very different kind of way. But most of us receive eulogies because telling a person's story is of value. 7 days then are committed once the burial takes place. It only goes into action at the burial, are committed to utter and complete mourning, sitting on uncomfortable chairs at home, people coming to visit you. You begin to recite the Kaddish. Now, the Kaddish is not a prayer. It's what we call a doxology. It means it's a constant praise of God. It is one praise after another praise after another praise of God. In fact, the Kaddish that's done by conservative and Reformed Jews at the graveside is not the one the Orthodox are doing. They have a whole thing about the resurrection in theirs that's been cut out. But the Kaddish that you hear, people frequently ask me as a humanistic rabbi, will you do the Kaddish? And I've certainly helped people say it if they need it and they want it. I'm not going to, at the person's saddest time in the world, I'm not going to suddenly tell them, no, you can't do that, and I won't do that. That's ridiculous. But I do encourage people at some later date to take a look at what it is or earlier date before their loved ones die, to take a look at what it says, because what it says is, yay, God, you're the best, you're the better than the rest, and it rhymes and it feels good, and it gives you that sort of rhythm. But it's just about how terrific the Lord is. There's nothing else in there. For 7 days, actually for 11 months, some say a year, you have to, if you're a mourner, and I won't get into what qualifies you as a mourner, but children in particular are required to do this. You're required to say this recitation, this doxology every day, preferably, excuse me, preferably at two main services. And in order to say it, you have to have a minyan, a quorum of 10 observant Jews, 10 men in Orthodox Judaism, 10 adult Jews in other branches of Judaism. But that's not the end of it, those 7 days. Those 7 days, everybody comes to your house and they do it there. But for the next 23 days, you continue to go to services every day. And then for the next 10 to 11 months, you also go and say different and similar things. And so there's a year of this. This is why congregations sponsor daily prayer services, because they want to give people the opportunity to say Kaddish. You can say all the required prayers at home by yourself, but there's a few things you can only say when you're in a quorum or with a minyan. If you're a traditional Jew or a Reformed Jew, it matters little. It only doesn't apply to those of us who don't pray, of which I am in their company. We have our own kind of humanistic Kaddish, but it's not a Kaddish. I will say this, I love a lot of things that Sherwin wrote, but he wrote some kind of cockamamie Kaddish in Aramaic, and that one, I've not done that one, I have to tell you. And then finally, once someone is gone, and I think this is a beautiful tradition, and we absolutely do this in humanistic Judaism, every year on the anniversary of their death, we observe what's called the yahrzeit. At home, people usually light a candle, a 24, 25-hour candle. In our congregation, we call up people to light a candle, and it's part of our service. I miss it. It's one of the few things that I can't replicate in any way, shape, or form on YouTube. And it really, it draws people in the way that the daily minyan, the daily service draws people in the traditional world. It draws people to us on a Friday night. Yahrzeit happens to be Yiddish, so that's not what it's called in all Jewish communities. The Sephardim call it something different. Frequently, they call it the Azkara, which is Aramaic for the memory. So that's where we're going to end with the life cycle tonight. It is, in any case, where life ends, so it's appropriate. And I take a minute if you guys have any questions. I know it's getting late. I apologize.